They called him the Sun King, the center of the universe, a living god draped in silk and gold, ruling from the most magnificent palace ever built. For 72 years, Louis XIV of France convinced the world, and himself, that he was immortal. But in August 1715, in a bedroom reeking of rotting flesh and medicinal herbs, the Sun King learned what every king before him had learned, that crowns don't stop death. They just make the fall more dramatic. This is the story of how the most powerful man in Europe died screaming, his leg literally rotting off his body while doctors sawed through gangrenous flesh without anesthesia. How the God King who built Versailles, that monument to human vanity, spent his final days watching his own body decompose while he was still alive to witness it. You won't find this version in the textbooks that worship at the altar of French glory. They'll tell you about his military victories, his cultural achievements, his absolute power. They'll show you paintings of him in ermine robes, portraits where he looks eternal, untouchable, divine. But they won't tell you about the smell, the screams, the way his physicians poured molten lead into his wounds trying to stop the infection, the way he could literally watch pieces of himself die and fall away, day after excruciating day. Because here's the secret that power never wants you to know. It doesn't matter how many palaces you build, how many wars you win, how many people bow at your feet. In the end, death comes for everyone. And sometimes it comes slowly, painfully, stripping away every illusion of grandeur until all that's left is a terrified old man begging for mercy from a god who isn't listening. Louis XIV reigned longer than any other European monarch, 72 years and 110 days. He transformed France into the dominant power of his age. He created cultural legacies that still echo today. He literally said, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. He believed it too. And then gangrene ate his leg. If you're ready for history that doesn't sanitize death, that doesn't pretend powerful men die peacefully in their sleep surrounded by weeping courtiers and heavenly light, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the truth about how the mighty fall, it's uglier, more human, and more important than any propaganda portrait could ever show you. Let me take you back to the summer of 1715, to the Palace of Versailles, where the sun was finally setting on the king who thought he'd shine forever. This is a story about mortality, about vanity, about what happens when a man who spent his entire life avoiding reality finally has to face it, one gangrenous inch at a time. To understand the horror of Louis XIV's death, you first have to understand the absurdity of his life. Born in 1638, Louis became king at age 4 after his father's death. But he didn't truly take power until 1661, when he was 23. And from that moment forward, he dedicated his existence to a single purpose, becoming not just a king but a legend, an icon, a celestial body around which all of Europe would orbit. The Sun King wasn't just a nickname, it was a brand. A carefully constructed identity that Louis XIV performed every single day of his adult life. He commissioned paintings showing him as Apollo, the Greek sun god. He built Versailles, that obscene monument to ego, where even going to the bathroom became a public ceremony attended by nobles fighting for the privilege to watch. Everything was theater. Everything was power made visible. His morning routine, the lever, was a ritual where dozens of aristocrats would gather to watch him get dressed. Each article of clothing handed to him by a different nobleman, each button a carefully orchestrated display of hierarchy and favor. At night, the coucher reversed the process. The king's body was public property, a holy relic on constant display. He controlled the French nobility by forcing them to live at Versailles, transforming deadly political rivals into glorified servants competing for the honor of holding his chamber pot. Brilliant? Absolutely. Deeply weird? Also yes. For 72 years it worked. Louis XIV fought wars that reshaped Europe. He revoked the Edict of Nantes and persecuted Protestants, driving hundreds of thousands from France. He patronized the arts, creating the French cultural dominance that still exists today. He was Molière's protector, Racine's patron, the man who made French the language of European diplomacy. He had mistresses celebrated like queens. Madame de Montespan bore him 7 children. Madame de Maintenon eventually became his secret second wife. He danced in ballets well into his 40s, because even physical movement was a demonstration of power and vitality. But here's what happens when you build your entire identity around being superhuman. You can never admit weakness. You can never show pain. You can never acknowledge that you're mortal because the moment you do, the entire illusion collapses. By 1715, Louis was 76 years old. For a man of that era, that was ancient. Most of his generation was long dead. He'd outlived his son, the Grand Dauphin. He'd outlived most of his grandchildren. The weight of all those years, all that power, all that performance, it was crushing. His body had been failing for years, actually. In 1686, he'd undergone a brutal surgery for an anal fistula, a painful infection that required cutting through flesh without anesthesia while courtiers waited outside to hear if their king survived. He did, but it was a preview of the medical horrors to come. By the summer of 1715, the Sun King was tired. Not just physically exhausted, but existentially weary. He'd been performing godhood for over 50 years. The mask was slipping. And underneath it? Just a frightened old man who could feel death circling closer. August arrived hot and oppressive. Louis complained of pain in his leg. Nothing serious, he thought. Just the aches of age. But this wasn't age. This was the beginning of the end, and it was going to be slow. In a society where the king's body was literally the body politic, where his health was a matter of national security, even acknowledging illness was dangerous. So Louis did what he'd always done. He performed strength. He continued his routines. He pretended everything was fine. But beneath his silk stockings, something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. The flesh of his leg was beginning to die. Think about that for a second. You're the most powerful person in your world, and you can feel your own body betraying you. What would you do? Admit weakness? Or keep pretending until pretending becomes impossible? Louis XIV chose to pretend. And that choice turned his death into a nightmare. On August 10, 1715, the king noticed a black spot on his left leg, just above his ankle. His doctors examined it with the kind of terrified attention you'd expect from physicians whose careers, and possibly lives, depended on keeping this particular patient alive. Their diagnosis: gangrene. For anyone living in 1715, that word was a death sentence. Gangrene meant your flesh was rotting, that the blood supply had been cut off, that tissue was literally dying while still attached to your body. And once it started, it spread. There was no cure. No antibiotics. No real understanding of how infection worked. The only treatment was amputation. Cut off the dying flesh before it killed the whole body. But you can't amputate a king's leg. Not the Sun King. Not the man who'd spent his entire life convincing Europe he was more than human. The political implications alone were staggering. A king without a leg? Unthinkable. Weak. Vulnerable. Human. So instead, his doctors tried everything else. They applied poultices made from herbs and animal fat. They bled him repeatedly, following the medieval logic that removing bad blood would somehow help. They gave him antimony, a toxic metal that was the chemotherapy of its day, poisonous enough to kill disease, hopefully before it killed the patient. Nothing worked. The black spot spread. The flesh around it turned gray, then green. The smell became unmistakable, the sweet, putrid stench of decomposition. The Sun King was rotting alive, and everyone in Versailles could smell it. Louis XIV, to his credit, faced this horror with more courage than you'd expect. He continued attending to state business even as the pain became unbearable. He received ambassadors while his leg was literally dying. He maintained the performance right up until the performance became physically impossible. By late August, the gangrene had consumed most of his lower leg. His doctors were now in full panic mode, trying increasingly desperate and brutal treatments. They poured boiling water on the wounds. They applied caustic substances meant to burn away dead tissue. They tried something called theriac, a supposed cure-all that was basically opium mixed with snake meat and other ingredients that sound like a witch's shopping list. Imagine the scene: the most magnificent bedroom in Europe, gilded and mirrored and beautiful, now transformed into a torture chamber. The smell of gangrene mixing with the smoke from the candles and incense burning constantly to mask the odor. Physicians surrounding the king's bed like vultures, each one terrified of being blamed when the inevitable happened. And in the center of it all, Louis XIV, the Sun King, watching his own leg turn black and fall apart piece by piece. On September 1st, he finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. He called for his great-grandson, the 5-year-old who would become Louis XV, and gave him advice that dripped with irony: "Do not imitate me in my love of building or in my love of war." This from the man who built Versailles and fought war after war for 70 years. But pain has a way of clarifying what actually matters. And what matters in the end isn't palaces or battle victories. It's not being remembered as a god. It's simply not being in agony. The gangrene reached his thigh. The fever climbed. The pain became so intense that even massive doses of opium couldn't control it. The Sun King, who had spent his life choreographing every moment of his public existence, lost control of his body completely. He screamed. He wept. He begged God for mercy. All the dignity, all the performance, all the divine majesty, stripped away by the simple biological reality of tissue death and systemic infection. His doctors finally attempted the amputation, but by then it was too late. The infection had spread too far. The gangrene had won. On the morning of September 1, 1715, at 8:15 a.m., Louis XIV died. Not peacefully. Not surrounded by heavenly light and angelic choirs. But in agony, his body half-rotted, his illusions finally and completely shattered. The man who had declared himself the state, who had built the most magnificent palace in Europe as a monument to his own glory, who had reigned longer than any European monarch before or since, died exactly like every other human being who'd ever lived. Afraid. In pain. And completely, utterly alone in the face of mortality. So here's the question nobody wanted to ask in 1715, and we still don't really want to ask now. What's the point of all that power if it can't save you from this? What's the point of building palaces if you can't take them with you? What's the point of being worshipped as a god if you die like everyone else? The sun had finally set, and the darkness that followed was absolute. The moment Louis XIV took his last breath, something extraordinary happened. Actually, something extraordinarily predictable happened. Everyone who had spent decades praising him, worshipping him, dedicating their lives to his service, they immediately began tearing apart his legacy. His body wasn't even cold before the criticism started. The wars had bankrupted France. The religious persecutions had weakened the economy. The extravagance of Versailles had drained the treasury while peasants starved. All the problems that everyone had been too terrified to mention while the Sun King lived suddenly became the only things anyone could talk about. The regent who took power during young Louis XV minority, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, reversed almost every policy Louis XIV had held sacred. The austere Madame de Maintenon, Louis's second wife, was packed off to a convent where she'd spent her youth, full circle back to irrelevance. The mistresses were scattered. The court that had orbited Louis like planets around the sun simply dispersed. And Versailles, that monument to eternal glory? It started falling apart almost immediately. Turns out that maintaining a palace with 2,300 rooms requires constant attention and enormous wealth. Within a generation, parts of it were already crumbling. The Hall of Mirrors, where Louis had held court like a god, developed leaks. Gardens became overgrown. The illusion of permanence revealed itself as exactly that, an illusion. But here's the truly fascinating part. Louis XIV's death didn't just mark the end of his reign. It marked the beginning of the end of absolute monarchy itself. His great-great-great-grandson would be the last king of France to die on the throne, because his great-great-great-great-grandson, Louis XVI, would die under a different kind of blade entirely. The guillotine. The seeds of the French Revolution were planted during Louis XIV's reign. The financial crisis, the inequality, the obsession with court ritual while the nation suffered, all of it came to a brutal harvest 74 years after the Sun King's death. So in a way, Louis XIV's rotting leg was a metaphor for France itself. The gangrene was already there, spreading beneath the silk stockings and the gilded surfaces. He just happened to be the one who could see it happening to his own body before it consumed the entire body politic. His funeral was surprisingly modest, given everything else about his life. No massive public ceremony. No weeks of national mourning. Just a relatively quick affair before the body could decompose further in the September heat. They buried him in the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. During the French Revolution, revolutionary forces broke into Saint Denis and desecrated the royal tombs. They pulled Louis XIV's body from its grave and threw it into a mass pit with other monarchs. The Sun King's final resting place? An unmarked hole in the ground, his bones mixed with the bones of the dynasty he'd worked so hard to glorify. Not even death granted him the dignity he'd spent a lifetime demanding. But his architectural legacy survived, barely. Versailles stood through the Revolution, through Napoleon, through 2 world wars. Today it's a museum, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, A testament to, what, exactly? Human achievement? Or human vanity? Maybe both. The Palace of Versailles now receives roughly 15 million visitors per year. They walk through those gilded halls, admire the Hall of Mirrors, pose for Instagram photos in the gardens. Most of them have no idea about the gangrenous leg, the screams of pain, the brutal reality of how the man who built all this actually died. We prefer our kings sanitized, legendary, safely dead and unable to remind us of the messy, terrifying reality of being human. Hit that like button if you think we need to remember the whole story, not just the propaganda version. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that power doesn't make you immortal. It just makes your fall more spectacular. Louis XIV died in agony, but his story lives on. And the lesson it teaches us? That's where things get really interesting. So what does the death of an 18th century French monarch have to do with you, sitting wherever you are right now, scrolling through videos on your phone? Everything. Because Louis XIV tragedy isn't really about gangrene or palaces. It's about the lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing the one truth that terrifies us most. We're all temporary. All of us. No matter how successful, how powerful, how Instagram perfect our lives look, we're all just biological organisms with an expiration date we can't control. Louis XIV spent 72 years building an identity around being more than human. The Sun King. The center of the universe. A living God. He convinced everyone around him it was true. He convinced himself it was true. And then reality arrived with gangrene. Look around at our modern world. Social media influencers carefully curating their lives to look perfect, immortal, untouchable. CEOs building empires as monuments to their own genius. Politicians convinced they're essential to the functioning of society. All of us, really, constructing versions of ourselves that deny our fundamental vulnerability. We filter our photos to look ageless. We chase success like it's a shield against mortality. We accumulate possessions as if having more stuff will somehow mean we get to stay longer. We build our own little Versailles out of achievements and acquisitions and carefully maintained images. But here's what Louis XIV learned in that bedroom reeking of rotting flesh. None of it matters when your body betrays you. The palace doesn't protect you. The power doesn't save you. The performance ends when the performer can't perform anymore. And that's not depressing. It's liberating. Because if you stop wasting your energy pretending you're immortal, you can finally start living like you're mortal. You can stop building monuments to yourself and start building connections with others. You can stop performing and start being authentic. You can admit that you're scared, that you're vulnerable, that you don't have all the answers, and discover that honesty is so much more powerful than any facade. Louis XIV's final piece of advice to his great-grandson was, "Do not imitate me." After 72 years of demanding imitation, of insisting everyone copy his style and bow to his vision, in the end he knew it was all a mistake. The wars, the building projects, the endless performance of greatness. He knew. But he knew too late. You don't have to wait until you're 76 with a gangrenous leg to figure this out. You can choose differently right now. You can stop measuring your worth by external achievements and start valuing the things that actually matter. Relationships, kindness, authenticity, the courage to be vulnerable. You can stop building your own Versailles, that carefully constructed image that requires constant maintenance and exhausts you to uphold. You can admit that the palace has leaks, that the gardens are overgrown, that sometimes you're just tired and scared and don't have it all figured out. And here's the beautiful secret. When you stop pretending to be immortal, you finally start living. Really living. Not performing life but experiencing it. Not building monuments that will crumble but creating moments that matter. The Sun King thought he'd shine forever. But every sun sets. Every king falls. Every carefully constructed identity eventually crumbles. The only question is, will you waste your life maintaining an illusion? Or will you embrace the messy, temporary, beautiful reality of being human while you still can? That's the story they don't tell you in history class. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, dying in agony, his leg rotting off, all his power and glory useless against basic biology. But here's the thing, his story isn't unique. Every powerful person throughout history has faced this same reckoning. The gap between the image they project and the reality they can't escape. Next time, I'm going to tell you about another ruler who built an empire on carefully constructed lies. Someone who convinced the world they were invincible, immortal, destined to rule forever. And then reality came crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. Think Louis XIV fall was dramatic? Wait until you see what happens when power meets paranoia, when absolute control meets absolute betrayal. It's going to blow your mind. But only if you're subscribed. Here's what I need you to understand. These stories exist in the forgotten margins of history. The textbooks gloss over them because they're uncomfortable. They reveal things about power and mortality that the powerful don't want us thinking about. If you click away now without subscribing, the algorithm buries this content. The next person never finds it. And these truths, the ones that show us that kings die screaming just like everyone else, that power is temporary, that vanity kills, they disappear again. Don't let that happen. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Comment below with your thoughts. Did Louis XIV get what he deserved, or is death the great equalizer that humbles us all? Share this video with someone who needs to remember that we're all mortal, that we're all temporary. And that's okay. Because these stories, they're not just about dead kings. They're about us. About the lies we tell ourselves and the truths we can't escape. I'll see you in the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, because history is always watching and the clock is always ticking.